The unforgiving sun beat down on Abigail Porter's back as she gripped the plow handles with raw, blistered hands. Sweat dripped from her brow, stinging her eyes as she squinted across the vast expanse of unturned soil that seemed to stretch endlessly before her. It was the spring of 1875, and the Kansas Territory showed no mercy to a woman trying to work the land alone. "Come on, Bessie," Abigail urged her tired mare, who strained against the harness. The horse whinnied in protest, pulling the heavy plow through another few feet of resistant earth before stopping completely, sides heaving with exhaustion. Abigail sighed, releasing the plow handles to wipe her forehead with the back of her sleeve. 6 months since Thomas had passed from the fever, and the farm was slipping through her fingers like the dry soil beneath her boots. She'd promised him on his deathbed that she would keep their dream alive, but standing alone in this vast field, that promise felt as heavy as the clouds gathering on the distant horizon. "Just a little more, girl," she coaxed the horse, her voice cracking with fatigue. Bessie's ears flicked back, but she didn't move. The mare had been working since sunrise, and it was well past noon now. They both needed rest. But the field wouldn't plow itself, and if she didn't get the corn planted within the week, there would be no harvest come fall. The distant sound of hoofbeats drew her attention to the western edge of her property. A rider approached, silhouetted against the afternoon sun. Abigail straightened, brushing loose strands of auburn hair from her face and tucking them back under her bonnet. Visitors were rare out here, 20 miles from the nearest town, and not all were welcome. As the rider drew closer, she could make out a tall figure on a chestnut stallion. The man rode with the easy confidence of someone who'd spent his life in the saddle. His broad shoulders were set against the horizon, and a worn Stetson shaded his face. A stranger, passing through perhaps, though there wasn't much beyond her farm except open prairie and the occasional homestead. Abigail stood her ground as the rider approached, one hand shielding her eyes from the sun, the other reflexively moving to the pocket of her apron, where she kept Thomas's small revolver. "Afternoon, madam," the stranger called, his voice carrying across the field. He tipped his hat respectfully, revealing a face weathered by sun and wind, but not unkind. His eyes, clear and blue as the summer sky, assessed her situation with a single glance. "Afternoon," she replied cautiously. "If you're looking for the town, you've missed your turn about 5 miles back." The man smiled, revealing straight white teeth beneath his mustache. "No, madam, not lost." He dismounted with fluid grace, revealing his tall frame. "Name's Holt Vance." He extended a gloved hand, then seemed to think better of it, noting her dirt-covered palms. "Couldn't help but notice you're having a bit of trouble with your plowing." Abigail lifted her chin. "We're managing just fine." Holt glanced at the exhausted mare, then at the small fraction of the field that had been turned. His expression remained neutral, but his eyes held a knowing look. "Looks like your horse could use a rest," he said gently. "And there's a good piece of field left to work before sundown." "I don't recall asking for your assessment, Mr. Vance," Abigail replied, her pride stinging worse than her blistered hands. He nodded, accepting the rebuke. "Fair enough." He turned to his horse, reaching into his saddlebag. Abigail tensed, but he merely withdrew a canteen of water. "Mind if I water my horse? Been riding since daybreak." She hesitated, then nodded toward the small creek that ran along the edge of her property. "Help yourself." As he led his horse to water, Abigail returned to Bessie, stroking the mare's neck. "Just a little rest, girl, then we'll try again," she murmured, aware of the stranger watching her from the creek bank. After watering his horse, Holt Vance didn't ride away as she'd expected. Instead, he approached her again, leading his stallion. "Mrs.?" he inquired politely. "Porter," she supplied after a moment. "Abigail Porter." "Mrs. Porter, I don't mean to intrude, but I've got a strong horse here who's been idle too long. Makes him restless." He patted the chestnut's neck. "Thunder here could use some honest work, and I reckon your field could use another horse, if you'd permit me." Abigail studied him suspiciously. Strangers didn't offer help without expecting something in return. "Why would you do that, Mr. Vance?" He shrugged, his expression open. "My pa always said a man should be useful wherever he finds himself. I find myself here." "And what would you want in return?" she asked bluntly. A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Maybe just a cup of water when we're done. It's thirsty work, plowing. Abigail weighed her options. The field needed plowing, and she was already a week behind. Pride was a luxury she couldn't afford if she wanted to keep her farm. One field, she conceded finally. I won't be beholden to you for more. Holt's smile widened. Yes, madam. He turned to his horse and began removing his gear, stacking his saddle and bags neatly by a tree. Then he examined her plow, testing its weight and balance. Good tool, he commented, but your trace needs adjusting. Horse is pulling harder than she needs to. Before Abigail could respond, he was already kneeling beside Bessie, his hands moving confidently to adjust the harness. The mare, usually skittish with strangers, stood calmly as he worked. There, he said, standing. That should make it easier on her. He turned to his own horse. Now, let's get Thunder hitched up alongside. 2 horses will make quick work of this field. As he worked to rig his stallion to join her mare at the plow, Abigail watched him with a mixture of suspicion and reluctant gratitude. His movements were efficient, practiced the motions of a man who knew farm work well. You're not a drifter, she observed, not a question. He glanced up, those blue eyes meeting hers directly. No, madam. Got a small spread about 30 miles east. Just returning from delivering some horses to Fort Larned. 30 miles is a long way from home. Sometimes the long way has its rewards. He finished securing the last strap and stepped back. There we go. Ready to try? Abigail moved to take her position behind the plow, but Holt was already there, his large hands gripping the handles. I can manage my own plow, Mr. Vance, she said stiffly. No doubt, he replied, his tone respectful. But I suspect those hands of yours could use a break. He nodded toward her reddened, blistered palms. Why don't you lead the horses? They'll respond better to a familiar voice. She wanted to refuse, to insist on handling the plow herself, but practicality won out. Her hands were raw, and the hardest part of plowing was guiding the heavy implement through the resistant soil. Very well, she conceded, moving to the front to take the reins. Bessie responds to gentle commands. Your horse might. Thunder will follow her lead, Holt assured her. He's good that way. Abigail clicked her tongue softly, urging the horses forward. Come on, Bessie, let's go, Thunder. To her surprise, both horses moved in unison, pulling steadily. With the adjusted harness and the added strength of the stallion, the plow cut through the earth with remarkable ease, turning over rich, dark soil in a neat furrow. Holt guided the plow with steady hands, his strength making the task look effortless. They worked in silence for a time, finding an unexpected rhythm together. By mid-afternoon, they had accomplished more than Abigail had managed in the entire morning. When they reached the end of a row, Holt suggested a brief rest for the horses. Abigail nodded agreement, and they led the animals to the shade of a large oak at the edge of the field. You handle that plow like you were born to it, she remarked, offering him the water dipper from the bucket she'd brought to the field that morning. He drank deeply before answering. My father believed in teaching his sons every aspect of running a farm, said a man should never ask workers to do something he couldn't do himself. Your father sounds like a wise man. He was. A shadow crossed Holt's face. Lost him 2 years ago. Fever took him and my mother both within a week of each other. Abigail's expression softened. I'm sorry for your loss. And I for yours, he replied quietly. I noticed the small cemetery plot when I rode in. Recent, I'd wager. Abigail looked away, her throat tightening. My husband, 6 months ago. Holt nodded, saying nothing more, but his silence was respectful, not awkward. They stood together in the shade, the shared understanding of grief creating an unexpected connection between them. After a few minutes, Abigail straightened her shoulders. We should get back to it if we want to finish before sundown. They returned to work, falling back into their rhythm. As the afternoon wore on, Abigail found herself watching Holt Vance with growing curiosity. He worked with focused determination, yet there was an ease to his movements that spoke of a man comfortable in his own skin. Occasionally, when they'd finished a particularly difficult section, he'd flash a quick smile her way that made something flutter unexpectedly in her chest. By the time the sun began its descent toward the horizon, they had plowed nearly the entire field. What would have taken Abigail days of grueling labor alone had been accomplished in a single afternoon with Holt's help. "That's about done it," he announced as they completed the final furrow. "Good soil you have here. Should grow fine corn." Abigail surveyed the field with satisfaction, pride welling in her chest. "Yes, it will." She turned to him, forcing herself to meet his eyes directly. "I'm obliged to you, Mr. Vance." He removed his hat, running a hand through his sweat-dampened hair. "Holt, please." "And it was my pleasure, Mrs. Porter." "Abigail," she corrected, surprising herself with the offer of familiarity. A smile spread across his face. "Abigail, then." She hesitated, then added, "The least I can do is offer you supper before you ride out. It's getting late, and 30 miles is a long journey on an empty stomach." "That's very kind," he replied, his eyes warming. "I'd be grateful to accept." As they unhitched the horses and gathered their equipment, Abigail felt an unfamiliar sense of lightness. For months, she'd carried the weight of the farm alone, stubbornly refusing help from neighbors out of pride and determination to prove she could manage. Yet somehow, accepting this stranger's assistance hadn't felt like defeat, perhaps because he'd offered it without pity, working alongside her as an equal. They walked side by side toward the small farmhouse, leading their tired horses, the lengthening shadows of evening stretching before them. "You've done well keeping this place up," Holt commented as they approached the neat whitewashed house with its small front porch. A kitchen garden grew to one side, and chickens pecked in a fenced yard nearby. "I try," Abigail replied simply, though his appreciation of her efforts warmed her. Inside the modest home, Abigail busied herself preparing a simple but hearty meal while Holt tended to the horses, ensuring both Bessie and Thunder were properly rubbed down, watered, and fed. By the time he returned to the house, washing up at the pump outside, she had set the table with a stew that had been simmering all day, fresh bread, and preserved vegetables from last year's harvest. "Smells wonderful," he said appreciatively as he took the seat she indicated. They ate at first in companionable silence, both hungry from the day's work. As they finished, Abigail found herself wanting to know more about this man who had appeared so unexpectedly and worked so tirelessly beside her. "You mentioned you have a spread east of here," she prompted. "What kind of operation?" "Mostly horses," Holt replied, helping himself to another piece of bread. "Started with just 3 mares and a stallion after the war. Built it up to a respectable breeding operation now. 30-some horses, good bloodlines." Pride touched his voice. "Also grow enough to feed them and me, with some to sell. You run it alone?" "Got a few hands who help, good men. But yes, it's my place." He paused, studying her across the table. "And you? This is a big farm for one person." Abigail's hands tightened around her cup. "Thomas, my husband, had big dreams. Wanted to build something to pass on to our children someday." She swallowed hard. "We'd been trying for 5 years. No luck yet when he took sick." Holt's expression was gentle with understanding. "And you stayed on." "This land is all I have left of him. Of our dream." She straightened in her chair. "I can make it work." "I believe you can," he said, his voice carrying a sincerity that surprised her. "But no one can do everything alone. Even with my men, there are days I wish I had a partner to share the load." Their eyes met across the table, and something unspoken passed between them. Abigail looked away first, rising to clear the dishes. "Will you be leaving at first light?" she asked, her back to him as she stacked the plates. There was a pause before he answered. "I should, but—" He hesitated. "That south field looks about ready for planting. Might go faster with 2. Abigail turned, studying his face for signs of pity or ulterior motives. She found neither, only a straightforward offer, and perhaps something more, a reluctance to leave that mirrored her own unexpected desire for him to stay. "I couldn't ask that of you," she said finally. "You're not asking, I'm offering." He stood, bringing his cup to the wash basin. Besides, Thunder could use another day of honest work before the long ride home. A smile tugged at her lips. "Is that so?" "Absolutely. Gets ideas above his station if he's idle too long." His eyes crinkled at the corners. "I could sleep in the barn. Be no trouble at all." "Nonsense," Abigail said firmly. "There's a perfectly good spare room. Thomas's brother used it when he visited." She busied herself with the dishes, not meeting his eyes. "If you're set on staying to help, The least I can do is provide a proper bed." And so it was decided. As darkness fell completely, Abigail showed Holt to the small room off the main living area. It was simply furnished with a narrow bed, a chest of drawers, and a chair by the window. "It's not much," she apologized. "It's perfect," he assured her. "I've slept under the stars more nights than I can count." A roof and a real bed are luxuries. Later, lying in her own bed across the hall, Abigail listened to the unfamiliar sounds of another person moving about her home. The floorboards creaked as Holt settled in, and she could hear the soft thud of boots being set aside. It had been 6 months since she'd shared her home with anyone, and she was surprised at how comforting it felt to have another presence nearby. Sleep came easier that night than it had in months. Morning arrived with golden light streaming through her window. Abigail woke to the aroma of coffee and the sound of movement in her kitchen. For a disoriented moment, she thought Thomas had returned, that the past 6 months had been a terrible dream. Then reality reasserted itself, and she remembered her unexpected guest. She dressed quickly and found Holt at her stove, frying eggs and bacon in her cast-iron skillet. He had already stoked the fire and brewed coffee. "Hope you don't mind," he said when he noticed her standing in the doorway. "Thought you could use a hot breakfast before we tackle that planting." "I don't mind at all," she replied, genuinely touched by the gesture. Thomas had never cooked. He'd considered it women's work. "Though I'm surprised a bachelor knows his way around a kitchen," Holt chuckled. "When you live alone, you learn to feed yourself or go hungry. I'm no fancy cook, but I can manage the basics." The eggs were perfectly cooked, the bacon crisp. They ate together at the kitchen table, planning the day's work. The corn needed planting, and Holt suggested they could also repair a section of fence he'd noticed was sagging near the western boundary. "I've been meaning to fix that," Abigail admitted. "Just haven't found the time." "4 hands make lighter work than 2, Holt replied simply. And so began their day, working side by side under the spring sun. They planted corn in the freshly turned field, Holt driving a stake at regular intervals to ensure straight rows while Abigail followed, dropping seeds and covering them with practiced movements. They talked as they worked, sharing stories of their lives. Abigail learned that Holt had fought for the Union in the war, serving with a Kansas cavalry regiment. He'd returned to find his family's small farm struggling, and had worked tirelessly to build it into something more substantial, focusing on horses because he'd always had a way with them. "Never thought I'd end up a horse breeder," he confessed as they paused for water. "Always saw myself as a farmer like my father. But you have to adapt to survive out here." "That you do," Abigail agreed, thinking of her own adaptation since Thomas's death. In turn, she told him about growing up in Illinois, the daughter of a school teacher, how she'd met Thomas when he'd come east looking for investors in western lands, his dreams of empire building captivating her young heart. Their journey west had been harder than she'd imagined, but she'd fallen in love with the open spaces and endless skies of Kansas. "Thomas had grand visions," she explained as they moved on to repairing the fence after midday. "Wanted thousands of acres eventually. I was more practical. Wanted to build slowly, make sure each piece was solid before adding more." Holt nodded, hammering a post into place. "Sounds like you complemented each other." "We did, in many ways." She paused, considering. "Though sometimes I think he saw me more as a helpmate for his ambitions than a partner in making decisions." "His loss, then," Holt said quietly. "A woman with your determination and sense deserves to be heard." Abigail glanced at him in surprise. Unused to such straightforward appreciation of her mind, rather than just her capabilities as a housekeeper or worker, Thomas had valued her industry, but rarely sought her opinion on matters he considered men's business. They finished the fence repairs as the afternoon waned, both satisfied with the solid result of their efforts. Walking back toward the house, Abigail realized they'd accomplished in one day what would have taken her a week alone. More than that, the work had been almost enjoyable with Holt's steady presence beside her. As they approached the house, Abigail noticed dark clouds building on the western horizon. "Looks like a storm coming," she observed. "Might be a good thing for the newly planted corn." Holt studied the sky with a practiced eye. "That's more than a spring shower brewing. Those clouds have the look of a real gully washer. Might want to secure anything that could blow away." They spent the next hour battening down the farm, bringing in tools, securing loose boards on the chicken coop, making sure the livestock had proper shelter. By the time they finished, the wind had picked up considerably, and the first distant rumbles of thunder could be heard. "Just in time," Holt remarked as they stepped onto the porch. "The first fat raindrops beginning to fall. That'll hit hard within the hour." Sure enough, by the time they had washed up and Abigail had prepared a simple supper, the storm was raging in full force. Rain lashed against the windows, and wind howled around the corners of the house. Occasional flashes of lightning illuminated the kitchen, followed by booming thunder that seemed to shake the very foundations. "Your roof sound?" Holt asked, as a particularly violent gust rattled the windows. "Thomas reinforced it last year," Abigail replied, though she couldn't help glancing upward nervously at a loud creak from the rafters. "It's weathered worse." They ate by lamplight, the storm creating a cocoon of intimacy around the small kitchen table. When a tremendous crash sounded outside, both jumped to their feet. "Sounded like a tree," Holt said grimly. "Near the barn, I'd guess." "The animals," Abigail said, already reaching for her coat. "You stay here," Holt advised, but she shook her head firmly. "My farm, my responsibility." A smile flickered across his face. "Then we'll go together." They battled their way across the yard, rain soaking them within seconds despite their coats. A massive oak had indeed fallen, partially crushing one corner of the barn roof. Inside, the horses were whinnying in distress, and Abigail's milk cow was bellowing anxiously. "Damage isn't as bad as it could be," Holt assessed, examining the roof. "Tree hit the corner, but the main support beams are intact." He glanced at Abigail. "Still, we should move the animals to the other end, just to be safe." Working together in the lantern light, they calmed and relocated the frightened livestock. Water was beginning to drip through in places, but Holt found some old canvas to cover the most valuable stored equipment. "We'll need to repair this properly when the storm passes," he said, securing the last corner of canvas. But this should hold for tonight. By the time they returned to the house, they were both drenched to the skin and shivering. Abigail stoked the fire to blazing, while Holt stepped into the spare room to change into dry clothes. When he emerged, she had hot coffee waiting. "Your turn," he said, nodding toward her soaked dress. "I'll keep the coffee warm." Gratefully, Abigail retreated to her bedroom, peeling off the sodden garments and changing into a simple house dress. When she returned to the kitchen, her hair loose and damp around her shoulders, she found Holt standing by the window, watching the storm's fury. He turned at her entrance, and something in his expression made her breath catch. For a moment, he simply looked at her, his eyes taking in her unbound hair and the simple dress that was more informal than anything he'd seen her wear. "Coffee's still hot," he said finally, his voice a touch rougher than usual. They sat before the fire, the storm raging outside, while they sipped their coffee in companionable silence. Eventually, Abigail spoke. "Thank you, for the barn, for everything today." Holt shook his head. "No need for thanks. Neighbors help neighbors out here. It's how we all survive." "We're hardly neighbors," Abigail pointed out. 30 miles is a fair distance." He smiled, the firelight catching in his eyes. "Close enough in this territory." Another crash of thunder shook the house, and the lamp on the table flickered. Abigail couldn't help but flinch slightly. "Not fond of storms?" Holt asked gently. She gave a rueful smile. "Never have been. My mother used to say I'd hide under the bed at the first rumble of thunder." She sipped her coffee. "I've gotten better, but something about the unpredictability still unnerves me." "Understandable. Nature at its most powerful can be frightening." He leaned forward, his expression thoughtful. "My grandmother had a different view. She was part Cherokee, saw storms as necessary cleansing. The sky is washing the earth, she'd tell me, making it new again." "That's a beautiful way to think of it," Abigail said, surprised by this revelation about his heritage. "She was a wise woman, taught me to respect nature's power, but not to fear it." He smiled at a memory. "Also taught me which plants healed and which would just as soon kill you." Useful knowledge out here. They talked late into the night as the storm gradually diminished to a steady rain. Holt told stories of his childhood, of riding with his father to Kansas City to sell horses, of learning to track game from an old trapper who'd once saved his father's life. Abigail shared memories of her mother's garden back in Illinois, of learning to make preserves and medicines from plants, of the books she'd loved as a girl. It was the most she'd talked to anyone since Thomas died, and she was surprised at how easy it was to converse with Holt. He listened intently, asked thoughtful questions, and seemed genuinely interested in her opinions and experiences. When a yawn finally overtook her, Abigail realized how late it had grown. "I should let you get some rest," she said, rising from her chair. "Morning comes early on a farm." Holt stood as well, towering over her in the small room. "That it does." He hesitated, then added, "I was thinking I might stay another day, if that's acceptable to you. That barn roof needs proper repair, and it's not a one-person job." Abigail knew she should politely decline, maintain her independence, but the truth was she'd accomplished more in 2 days with Holt's help than in weeks alone. And there was something else, something she was reluctant to admit even to herself. She wasn't ready for him to leave. "That would be most helpful," she said carefully, "though I don't want to keep you from your own responsibilities." "My foreman can manage another day without me," he assured her, "and I'd rest easier knowing your barn is secure." "Then I accept your offer, with thanks." Their eyes met in the soft lamplight, and for a moment, something unspoken hung in the air between them. Then Holt nodded and stepped back. "Good night, Abigail." "Good night, Holt." In her bed that night, listening to the gentle patter of rain on the roof, Abigail found herself thinking about the man sleeping across the hall. There was something about Holt Vance that called to her his quiet strength, his respect for her capabilities, the way he worked beside her rather than for her or over her. It had been a long time since she'd felt so comfortable in anyone's presence. The realization was unsettling. She'd resigned herself to life alone after Thomas, had accepted that as her fate. She hadn't expected to feel this stirring of interest in another man, especially not so soon. It felt almost like a betrayal of Thomas's memory. Yet as she drifted toward sleep, she couldn't help but remember Holt's smile in the firelight, and the way his eyes had lingered on her unbound hair. Morning dawned clear and fresh, the world washed clean by the night's storm. Abigail rose early, determined to have breakfast ready before Holt awoke, but she found the kitchen empty, the back door standing open. Through the window, she could see him in the yard, already assessing the storm damage in the growing light. She watched him for a moment, appreciating his methodical inspection of the property. He moved with purpose but without hurry, taking time to examine each structure carefully. It was the manner of a man who understood that thoroughness now prevented problems later, exactly the approach she valued herself. By the time she called him in for breakfast, Holt had compiled a mental list of repairs needed beyond the barn roof. Several fence posts had been weakened, a corner of the chicken coop needed reinforcement, and the storm had carved a gully through one corner of the newly planted field. "Nothing that can't be fixed," he assured her as they ate. "The barn roof is the priority, but we should be able to tackle most of it today." They spent the morning on the barn, Holt climbing onto the damaged roof while Abigail handed up tools and materials from a ladder. The oak had done less damage than they'd feared, crushing only a small section of the overhang. By midday they had removed the damaged beams, and Holt was cutting replacements from lumber stored in the back of the barn. "Your husband kept a well-stocked woodpile," he commented as he measured and sawed. "Good foresight." "Thomas was always preparing for contingencies," Abigail replied, holding the board steady. Said a farmer who wasn't ready for disaster was asking for one. "Wise man." Holt tested the cut, nodded with satisfaction, and began shaping the end to fit the joint. "My father was the same way, used to drive my mother crazy, storing things just in case. But more than once, those supplies saved us when times got lean." They worked through the afternoon, repairing the roof, then moving on to the other storm damage. Side by side, they mended fences, reinforced the chicken coop, and dug a drainage channel to protect the cornfield from future washouts. By sunset, the farm was secure again, and they were both exhausted but satisfied with the day's accomplishments. Over supper, Holt brought up his departure. "I should head back tomorrow," he said, a note of reluctance in his voice. "My foreman's capable, but there's business I need to attend to." Abigail nodded, ignoring the sinking feeling in her stomach. "Of course. You've already done far more than I could have asked." "I've been thinking," he said, setting down his fork. "That corn will need tending in the coming weeks, and there's the rest of your fields to consider for later planting. "I'll manage," Abigail said automatically. Holt's expression was serious. "I don't doubt it, but I have a proposition if you're willing to hear it." She raised an eyebrow. "I'm listening." "I could send one of my hands over once a week to help with the heavier work. Jacob's young but strong, and he knows farming. Would give you an extra pair of hands for the difficult tasks." Abigail's pride warred with practicality. The help would be invaluable, but accepting regular assistance felt like admitting defeat in her determination to run the farm independently. "I can pay fair wages," she said finally. Holt shook his head. "I wasn't offering to hire him out to you. I was thinking more of a cooperative arrangement. Your farm's on my route to Fort Larned. I make that trip every few weeks to deliver horses. Jacob could stop by on those days, help with whatever needs doing. In exchange, perhaps you might be willing to provide a meal and some of your preserved goods when harvest comes." It was a reasonable proposal, phrased in a way that preserved her dignity. Still, Abigail hesitated. "Why would you do this?" Holt met her eyes directly. "Because I admire what you're trying to do here. Because surviving alone in this territory is harder than it needs to be when neighbors could help each other." He paused. "And because I've enjoyed these days working alongside you, and I'd like an excuse to stop by myself when I'm passing through." The last admission hung in the air between them, honest and uncomplicated. Abigail felt her cheeks warm, but she didn't look away. "I'd like that too," she said quietly. His smile was slow and pleased. "Then we have an arrangement?" "We do," she agreed. "Though I insist the preserves be considered payment, not charity." "Absolutely." He extended his hand across the table, and she took it. His palm was warm and calloused against hers, the handshake sealing their agreement, lasting perhaps a moment longer than strictly necessary. That evening, their last together for the time being, had a different quality to it. There was an awareness between them now, an acknowledgement of mutual interest that hadn't been voiced, but was nevertheless present in every glance, every casual touch, as they cleared the supper dishes together. They sat on the porch afterward, watching twilight settle over the land. Fireflies began to rise from the grass, their tiny lights blinking in the growing darkness. In the distance, coyotes called to one another, their yipping cries echoing across the prairie. "I love this time of day," Abigail said softly. "Everything's settling down, becoming quiet." "It's peaceful," Holt agreed. "Different from dawn, which always feels full of possibilities and work to be done. Evening has its own kind of promise." She glanced at him. "What kind of promise?" "Rest, reflection." His voice deepened slightly. "Connection." Their eyes met in the fading light, and Abigail felt a flutter of anticipation in her chest. Holt leaned toward her slowly, giving her every opportunity to move away if she wished. When she didn't, he gently brushed a strand of hair from her face, his fingers lingering against her cheek. "I'd very much like to kiss you, Abigail Porter," he said quietly. "But only if that's what you want too." The directness of his request was startling and refreshing. Thomas had never asked, simply assumed his rights as a husband. This offering of choice made her heart beat faster. "Yes," she whispered. "I'd like that." He closed the distance between them, his lips meeting hers with gentle pressure. The kiss was tender, almost tentative at first, then deepening as Abigail responded, her hand rising to rest against his chest. She could feel his heartbeat beneath her palm, strong and slightly accelerated, matching her own. When they finally drew apart, Holt kept his face close to hers, his eyes searching her expression in the dim light. "I've been wanting to do that since yesterday," he admitted, a smile in his voice. "Only yesterday?" Abigail teased softly. "I think I've been waiting since you first rode up to my field." His low chuckle sent a pleasant shiver through her. "Then I should have been braver sooner." They sat together on the porch until the stars came out in full glory, talking intermittently, but often simply existing in comfortable silence. Occasionally, Holt would take her hand or brush his fingers along her arm, each touch causing a warm glow to spread through Abigail's body. When they finally rose to retire for the night, there was a moment of tension at the doorway to her bedroom. Holt brought her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles. "Good night, Abigail," he said, his voice husky. "I'll see you at dawn." Part of her wanted to invite him to stay, but it was too soon. the feelings between them too new and fragile. Instead, she squeezed his hand. Until dawn, then. Morning came all too quickly. They shared a quiet breakfast, both aware of the impending separation. Afterward, Abigail watched as Holt saddled Thunder, securing his belongings for the journey. "I should reach my place by nightfall," he told her, tightening the saddle girth. "I'll send Jacob your way next week, likely Wednesday." "I'll look forward to it," she replied, though they both knew it wasn't Jacob's visit she was anticipating. When the horse was ready, Holt turned to her, taking both her hands in his. "I meant what I said about stopping by when I'm passing through." "I'll hold you to that," Abigail said, trying to keep her tone light despite the heaviness in her chest. He drew her closer, one hand releasing hers to cup her cheek. "May I write to you as well?" The question touched her deeply. Letter writing was a commitment of time and thought, especially for a busy rancher. "I'd like that very much." "Good." He smiled, then leaned down to kiss her, more firmly than the night before, a promise in the pressure of his lips against hers. When he pulled back, his eyes were bright with feelings neither was quite ready to name. "Take care of yourself, Abigail Porter." "And you, Holt Vance?" She stood in the yard, watching as he mounted Thunder and rode away, turning once to wave before disappearing over the rise to the east. Only then did she allow herself a small sigh, already missing his steady presence beside her. But there was work to be done, always work on a farm, and Abigail turned back to her house with renewed determination. She had corn to tend, chickens to feed, and a future that suddenly seemed brighter than it had in months. True to his word, Jacob arrived the following Wednesday, a gangly young man of perhaps 20 with a ready smile and strong back. He worked diligently alongside Abigail, helping to weed the emerging corn and repair additional storm damage they hadn't addressed. He spoke highly of Holt, confirming what Abigail had already sensed, that the rancher was respected by his workers for his fairness and work ethic. More importantly, a letter arrived with Jacob, the paper slightly creased from its journey in his saddlebag. Abigail waited until evening to read it, savoring the anticipation. Holt's handwriting was surprisingly neat for a rancher, his words thoughtful and direct. He described his journey home, the condition of his ranch upon his return, and his thoughts about her farm's potential. The letter ended with a simple but affecting line. "The evening sky here reminds me of watching the fireflies rise with you, until I return, Holt." Abigail read it twice before carefully folding it and placing it in her dresser drawer. Then she sat at her small writing desk and composed a reply, telling him about the progress of the corn, Jacob's helpful assistance, and her plans for the summer planting. She found herself including small details she might otherwise have considered trivial: the robin's nest in the oak by the porch, the way the evening light turned the prairie grass to gold, the satisfaction of seeing the first green shoots breaking through the soil she'd planted with his help. Jacob delivered her letter on his departure, promising to return the following week. A pattern developed over the following month. Jacob would arrive on Wednesday morning, work through the day, deliver any letter from Holt, and depart the next morning with Abigail's reply. Through their correspondence, Abigail learned more about Holt's life and character. He wrote of his struggles establishing his horse breeding operation, the satisfaction of seeing his careful breeding choices vindicated in the quality of the foals, his hopes to expand the business further west eventually. She told him about her dreams for the farm, her determination to make it not just survive, but thrive, her memories of Thomas that were gradually becoming less painful to recall. Their letters grew increasingly personal as the weeks passed. Holt confessed his loneliness at times, despite the presence of his workers. Abigail admitted her occasional moments of despair in the months after Thomas's death, when the task of running the farm alone had seemed impossible. They shared childhood memories, hopes for the future, and gradually, their growing feelings for each other. "I find myself watching the eastern horizon," Abigail wrote in early June, hoping to see a rider approaching. "The farm feels different when you are here, more alive somehow, as though your presence brings color to a world that has been rendered in shades of gray." Holt's reply came the following week. "I've never been one for poetic language, but I understand exactly what you mean. My ranch has everything I've worked for, yet lately it feels incomplete. I find myself counting the days until my next journey to Fort Larned, knowing I'll stop at your farm along the way." True to his word, Holt appeared at her farm in mid-June, ostensibly en route to deliver horses to the fort. His face lit up when he saw her standing in the dooryard, and Abigail felt her heart race as he dismounted and strode toward her. Their greeting was restrained but warm, mindful of Jacob's presence nearby. That evening, after Jacob had retired to the barn loft where he slept during his visits, they sat together on the porch, hands intertwined, catching up on the details their letters hadn't conveyed. "The corn looks good," Holt observed. "Should be a strong harvest." "Thanks in part to Jacob's help," Abigail acknowledged. "He's been invaluable." "He says the same about your cooking," Holt chuckled. "Claims he's never eaten so well as on his weekly visits here." They talked late into the night, and when Holt finally rose to retire to the spare room, their goodnight kiss lingered, filled with the longing of weeks apart. It took all of Abigail's willpower to step back, to maintain the proper boundaries they had silently agreed upon, despite their growing attraction. Holt stayed 3 days, helping with farm projects each day, and spending the evenings with Abigail, their connection deepening with every conversation, every shared laugh, every brief touch. When he departed, the farewell was more difficult than before, but softened by his promise to return within the month. July brought intense heat and the constant work of tending the growing crops. Jacob's weekly visits continued. Ann Holt's letters arrived regularly, becoming a bright point in Abigail's busy weeks. In late July, he wrote with news, "I've been invited to participate in a horse auction in Kansas City in early September. It's an opportunity to showcase my stock to buyers from back east, potentially expanding my business considerably. I'll be traveling with 4 of my finest horses, and my route will take me directly past your farm. I wonder if I might impose upon your hospitality for a night or two as I pass through." Abigail's reply was immediate and enthusiastic. By then, the corn was tall and promising, and she'd planted additional crops that were flourishing. The farm was beginning to feel like a success rather than a burden, and she looked forward to showing Holt how much progress she'd made with his and Jacob's assistance. August passed in a blur of activity, harvesting early crops, preparing for the corn harvest, preserving vegetables for the winter. Jacob reported that Holt was busy preparing his horses for the upcoming auction, training them to show their best qualities to the discerning Eastern buyers. "Never seen the boss so focused," Jacob told Abigail as they worked together to repair the chicken coop. "Says this auction could change everything for the ranch if it goes well." "He deserves success," Abigail replied, holding a board steady while Jacob nailed it in place. "He works harder than anyone I know." Jacob grinned knowingly. "He's been working even harder lately, wants to expand the operation, says he's got plans for the future that need funding." Something in the young man's tone made Abigail glance at him sharply, but Jacob merely continued hammering, his expression innocent. Early September brought the first hints of autumn cooler mornings, changing light, and the promise of harvest. Abigail prepared for Holt's visit with unusual care, ensuring the house was spotless, cooking his favorite dishes, and even purchasing a new dress from the dry goods store in town during her monthly supply trip. She spotted his approach from a distance, the distinctive silhouette of a man leading several horses across the prairie. As he drew closer, she could see 4 horses on lead lines behind Thunder, magnificent animals that moved with grace and power even at a walk. Holt's face broke into a wide smile when he saw her waiting by the gate. He quickened his pace, and as soon as he'd secured the horses in her corral, he strode toward her, sweeping her into an embrace that lifted her feet from the ground. "I've missed you," he murmured against her hair before setting her down gently. "And I you," she replied, her hands resting on his chest, feeling the strong beat of his heart beneath her palms. That evening, after a hearty meal, and once the horses were settled for the night, they sat together on the porch swing Holt and Jacob had built during his last visit. The air was cool and sweet with the scent of ripening corn, and stars speckled the vast Kansas sky above them. "Your horses are beautiful," Abigail said, leaning comfortably against his side, his arm around her shoulders. "They're sure to fetch good prices at the auction." "I hope so," Holt replied, his fingers absently stroking her arm. "I've put everything into breeding and training them. If they sell well, it could mean a real future for the ranch." "And what does that future look like?" she asked, curious about the plans Jacob had hinted at. Holt was quiet for a moment, his expression thoughtful in the soft lamplight spilling from the window. "I've been thinking about that a great deal lately," he said finally. 5 years ago, I would have said success meant more land, more horses, more hands working for me. And now?" He shifted slightly to look at her directly. "Now I find myself wanting something different, something more." His eyes held hers intently. "I want a partner, Abigail. Someone to share the work with, yes, but more importantly, someone to share the rewards, the challenges, the quiet evenings when the day's work is done." Abigail's heart began to beat faster. "That sounds like a fine ambition." "Does it?" His hand moved to cup her cheek. "Because I've realized over these past months that a successful business means little without someone to share it with. And there's only one woman I can imagine building that future alongside." She covered his hand with her own. "Holt, let me finish," he said gently. "I know it's soon. I know you're still establishing your independence here, still honoring what you and Thomas built. I respect that more than I can say. But I also know that what's growing between us is rare and precious." "It is," she agreed softly. "I'm not asking for an answer tonight," he continued. "Only that you consider what might be possible. My ranch is 30 miles away, but distances can be bridged, farms can be combined or managed separately. There are many ways to build a life together, if that's what you want too." Abigail's eyes filled with unexpected tears. "I've been thinking about possibilities too," she admitted. "About how empty this place feels when you leave, how I count the days between your visits, how your letters have become the brightest points in my weeks." Holt's expression brightened with hope. "Does that mean—" "It means I need a little time," she interrupted gently. "Not because I'm uncertain about my feelings for you, but because I made a promise to Thomas that I would keep this farm alive. I need to be sure of how to honor that promise while still following my heart." He nodded, disappointment tempered by understanding. "I can give you time. I just wanted you to know where I stand, what I hope for." "I value your honesty," she said, leaning forward to kiss him softly. "And I promise not to keep you waiting too long for my answer." They spent the next 2 days together, working the farm by day and talking late into the night. Holt helped Abigail begin the corn harvest, the two of them working side by side in companionable rhythm. In the evenings, they discussed possibilities how their separate properties might be managed if they decided to join their lives, the challenges and benefits of such an arrangement. When the time came for Holt to depart for Kansas City, their farewell was filled with both hope and uncertainty. He would be gone for nearly 2 weeks, first attending the auction and then delivering the remaining horses to Fort Larned before returning to his ranch. "I'll stop here on my way back," he promised, holding her close. "Whatever your decision, Abigail, know that these months have been the happiest I've known in years." "For me as well," she replied, reaching up to touch his face, memorizing its contours. Their kiss was tender yet passionate, a promise of what might be if they found a way forward together. Then Holt mounted Thunder, the 4 prize horses lined up behind him, and rode toward Kansas City and the auction that could change his fortunes. In his absence, Abigail threw herself into the corn harvest, working alongside Jacob and occasionally hiring additional help from nearby farms. The crop was abundant, exceeding her expectations, and she felt a surge of pride knowing that her first harvest without Thomas was a success. But even as she celebrated this achievement, she found herself contemplating Holt's words about partnership and shared futures. Each night, she sat on the porch, looking out over the land she and Thomas had dreamed of building into an empire. The farm was thriving now, but was maintaining it alone truly honoring Thomas's memory? Or was she simply clinging to the past out of fear of moving forward? One evening, as she sorted through Thomas's papers in search of the deed to compare boundary lines with a neighboring property, Abigail came across his journal. She'd avoided reading it after his death, respecting his privacy even in death, but now she felt drawn to it, hoping perhaps to find clarity in his words. The journal entries revealed a man ambitious and driven, determined to build something lasting in this harsh territory. But they also showed Thomas's practical side, his understanding that adaptation was necessary for survival. In one of his final entries, written just weeks before he fell ill, he'd noted, "A man's legacy isn't in the land he acquires, but in the lives he touches. If I leave nothing else behind, I hope to have made Abigail's life richer for having shared it with me." Tears blurred Abigail's vision as she read those words. Thomas hadn't seen the farm as his legacy, but rather their shared happiness. She'd been so focused on maintaining the physical property that she'd lost sight of the more important inheritance, the capacity to love and build a meaningful life. With sudden clarity, Abigail understood that honoring Thomas didn't mean sacrificing her future happiness. It meant embracing the chance to love again, to create a new chapter that built upon rather than replaced what had come before. When Jacob arrived the following Wednesday, she sent him back to Holt's ranch with a letter that simply read, "My answer is yes. Whatever challenges lie ahead, I want to face them with you. Come home soon. Abigail." The days until Holt's return stretched endlessly. Abigail continued the harvest, preserved vegetables for winter, and began preparations for combining the operations of two farms. She made lists of what could be moved, what should stay, what might be sold if they decided to consolidate onto one property. Finally, nearly 2 weeks after his departure, Abigail spotted a familiar figure on the eastern horizon. She abandoned the preserves she'd been preparing and ran to the porch, her heart pounding with anticipation. As Holt drew closer, she could see he was riding hard, as eager to reach her as she was to see him. He dismounted before Thunder had fully stopped, striding toward her with purpose. "You said yes," he said, his voice filled with wonder as he reached the porch. "I did," she confirmed, smiling up at him. "I've been carrying this since I left for Kansas City," Holt said, reaching into his pocket to withdraw a small velvet pouch. "I bought it in town before I last came to see you, hoping but not daring to believe you might accept." From the pouch he withdrew a ring, a simple gold band set with a small but perfect diamond that caught the afternoon sunlight. "It's not fancy," he apologized, "but it's solid and true, like what I feel for you." "It's beautiful," Abigail whispered, tears filling her eyes. Holt took her hand, his expression solemn despite the joy in his eyes. "Abigail Porter, will you marry me? Will you join your life with mine, your dreams with mine, your future with mine?" "Yes," she answered without hesitation. "With all my heart, yes." He slipped the ring onto her finger, then pulled her into an embrace that felt like coming home. Their kiss was a seal on the promise, a beginning rather than an ending. That evening, as they sat together planning their shared future, Holt told her about the auction. His horses had fetched excellent prices, providing the capital needed to expand his breeding operation. The buyers had been impressed not just with the horse's quality, but with Holt's knowledge and integrity. "I've been offered a contract to supply cavalry mounts," he explained, still slightly amazed by the opportunity. "It would mean security for years to come." "That's wonderful," Abigail said, genuinely happy for his success. "You deserve it after all your hard work." They discussed practical matters, whether to base their operations at his ranch or her farm, how to manage the distance between properties, when to hold the wedding. But underlying all the logistics was a current of joy, a shared excitement about building a life together. "I was thinking," Holt said as they sat by the fire later that night, "that we might consider a compromise about the properties." "What kind of compromise?" Abigail asked, curious. "Your farm is excellent for crops, while my land is better suited for raising horses. What if we maintained both? My foreman could oversee daily operations at the horse ranch, with me riding over regularly. We could make this farm our primary home, expanding the crop production with the added help of my hands when needed." Abigail considered the proposal. "It would mean you'd be away sometimes, managing the horse operation." "Yes," he acknowledged, "but not for long stretches, and it would mean honoring your promise to Thomas, keeping this farm productive and growing." The thoughtfulness of his suggestion touched her deeply. "You've given this a lot of consideration. I want you to be happy," he said simply. "I want us to build something together that respects what came before while creating something new." "I think it could work," she said slowly, "though we might want to consider building a small cabin on your property for when we need to stay there." Holt grinned. "I was hoping you'd say that. I've already been eyeing a spot with a view of the creek that would be perfect." They were married in late October, after the harvest was complete and before winter set in. The ceremony was small but joyful, held in the church in town, with Jacob serving as best man and Abigail's friend Sarah from the neighboring farm as matron of honor. The reception was held at the farm, with neighbors and friends gathering to celebrate the union of two people who had found each other against the odds. As they danced together in the barn cleared for the occasion, Holt held Abigail close, his voice soft in her ear. "Happy, Mrs. Vance?" "Completely," she replied, looking up at her husband with a heart full of love. "Though, I must admit, there are moments when I still can't believe how quickly life can change." "How so?" he asked, guiding her in a gentle turn. "6 months ago, I was a widow struggling to plow a field alone, determined to make it on my own." She smiled at the memory. "Then, a stubborn cowboy rode up and hitched his horse beside mine, insisting on helping until the work was done. Best decision I ever made," Holt said, his eyes warm with tenderness. "Riding down that trail and seeing you there, so determined despite everything." "We've both come a long way since then," Abigail observed. "And we have a long way yet to go," he replied, "together." The following spring found them working side by side once again, plowing the same field where they had first met. Their first year of marriage had brought both challenges and joys: the harsh winter, the successful expansion of the horse breeding operation, the establishment of their routine between the two properties. They had built the cabin on Holt's ranch as planned, a cozy 2-room structure where they stayed during the busy breeding season. The rest of the time, they made their home at Abigail's farm, which was flourishing under their combined care. With Jacob's promotion to foreman, Holt was able to divide his time between the properties, ensuring both operations thrived. As they reached the end of a furrow, Holt stopped the team, turning to his wife with a smile. "Easier with 2, isn't it?" "Everything is," Abigail agreed, resting her hand on her slightly rounded belly where their first child was growing. "Though soon we'll be 3. Holt's expression softened as he placed his hand over hers. "I can't wait to teach him or her everything about this land, these horses, this life we've built. Our child will have the best of both worlds," Abigail said. "Your horses and my crops, your strength and my determination. Poor child won't stand a chance against that combination of stubbornness," Holt laughed, drawing her close for a kiss. As they resumed their plowing, Abigail reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. From a widow determined to make it alone to a wife and mother-to-be, building a future with a man who had quite literally hitched his horse beside hers when she needed it most. The Kansas sun warmed their backs as they worked the fertile soil, preparing it for new growth. New life, a fitting metaphor for the love that had taken root between them and now flourished, strong and enduring as the land itself.